With that, let me jump right in. I've introduced Stephen. Emily Jin is a China analyst at a pretty interesting newish company, Datenna, which is a company that focuses on all sorts of deep dives into Chinese language, data, literature, et cetera. She specializes in U.S.-China economic and technological competition and the impact on U.S. economic resilience and national security. She was previously at the Center for New American Security. Rick Switzer, former director at State Department, really one of the leading voices and experts who was in the U.S. government on this space, knows an incredible amount. Former director of policy at the critical and emerging technology at State, 25 years experience on this issue. So with that, over to Steve.
Well, thanks, Rob. I'm Stephen Ezell, Vice President, Global Innovation Policy at ITIF. For those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan science and technology policy think tank here in town. We've been ranked the world's leading science and tech policy think tank by the University of Pennsylvania for multiple years running. So, as Rob mentioned, our study is the culmination of a 20-month investigation that relied on a mixture of qualitative and quantitative analysis. Qualitatively, we conducted deep roundtables with a number of experts in the fields across various advanced technology industries. We did deep dive case studies of 44 Chinese firms, looking at things such as their levels of R&D investment, how many R&D personnel they had, whether these companies had innovation teams inside the organization, what types of international awards they'd won in their fields, what market share do they have, and did assessments against global leaders in those fields. So here are the 10 industries we looked at: robotics, chemicals, nuclear, electric vehicles and batteries, machine tools, biopharmaceuticals, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and displays. So overall, we find that while the Chinese innovation system is not perfect, it is much stronger than was previously understood. And while the evidence suggests that China hasn't yet taken the overall lead, it has pulled ahead in certain areas. And in many others, Chinese firms will likely equal or surpass Western firms within a decade or so. So specifically, what we did for these 44 of companies in these 10 industries is look at their position vis-a-vis global leaders in their fields, and then kind of assess their pace of progress. And as you can see here, we find that on a 10-point scale, essentially where we had 1 being a firm being completely a copier with no real innovation, to 10, these companies being moderately to significantly ahead of the global leading edge, kind of 8 being at par, kind of at the leading edge, or 6 being lagging, but just by a couple of years, just with 2 years. We find that on this 10-point scale, it's really in nuclear and electric vehicles and batteries where Chinese firms and industries are doing the best. When we look at nuclear, for instance, China is currently deploying more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world combined. China has deployed more nuclear reactors in the past 10 years than the United States has in the past 30 years. They're going to surpass us in nuclear power generation by the year 2030. Also, in terms of innovation, China is the first country in the world to have operationally deployed 4th generation nuclear reactors. These are ones with new designs, new passive safety systems. China is overall, according to an assessment from RPE, at least 10 years ahead of the United States in nuclear power. Electric vehicles and batteries. It's amazing to think that in the year 1985, China manufactured a grand total of 5,200 cars. This year, they're going to manufacture 26.8 million vehicles. That'll be 21% of global share. They're expected to hit 30% of global share by the end of this decade. And when we look at EVs particularly, China is now manufacturing 62% of the world's electric vehicles, 77% of the world's EV batteries. You can go down the list. I'll just pick out a couple others. I won't look at all of them. But biopharmaceuticals is an interesting one. We find there that China still lags American Western leaders. but they're rapidly catching up. In fact, the data shows that from 2002 to 2019, China's share of global value added in the biopharmaceutical industry increased fourfold to nearly 25%. And just over the past 5 years, China's share of oncology drugs under development has tripled to nearly 20% of the global share. Robotics. Interestingly, with robotics, we found that the Chinese companies themselves weren't as innovative as their American, Korean, or Japanese peers, with the exception of KUKA now, which was bought, of course, from the Germans, and it is a Chinese firm now. So while the robotics firms themselves weren't as innovative, what was interesting was that China last year deployed more industrial robots than the rest of the world combined. And so this means that they're going to see the impacts of robotics and automation catalyzing across the rest of their manufacturing economy. Just to pick out one more, because I wrote it, semiconductors. Semiconductors was an interesting one because when you talk about semiconductors, you're really talking about 6 or 7 different industries within the semiconductor category, right? There's the manufacturer of the logic chips versus the memory chips. There's the aftermarket assembly, test, and packaging. There's design, et cetera. So if you delve into my deep report on semiconductors, you'll see the sector by sector analysis. Overall, what we find is that in semiconductors, China is probably about 2 to 5 years behind global leaders. A recent teardown of a Huawei chip found them about 3 years behind. What's interesting, if you hear like Dan Hutchison, who runs a group called VLSI Research, he said a decade ago, China was about 3 to 4 years behind America in semiconductors. 5 years ago, it was that far behind. And today, it's still that far behind. This is why for semiconductors, we find that their position versus leaders is lagging and the rate of catch up is modest. I'm happy to take questions on the other ones. But overall, the report, our assessment finds that, as I said, Chinese firms and industries are far more innovative than we generally give them credit for, and they're catching up rapidly, virtually across every advanced industry technology domain. Thank you. And with that introduction, I will turn it over to Emily and Rick for additional analysis. Either way, Emily, whatever.
Can y'all hear me? Okay, awesome. Thanks, Rob and Stephen and the rest of the ITIF team for this timely study and event. I'm excited to discuss China's innovation capacity with you today. As a China analyst at Datenna, a company specializing in China techno-economic open source intelligence, AI software services, I just have to begin by making clear that all my remarks today are just solely my own opinion, not those of Datenna. So it's a truism, perhaps, that innovation is a key driver of national power. Among nations aiming for tech dominance, China is particularly ambitious in its pursuit of technological leadership to secure its global position. As the ITIF study and report highlight, Chinese industries are either leaders or more frequently copiers and fast followers. The more I read these reports, the more I became fixated on a fundamental question: what exactly is innovation? While we often think about innovation as groundbreaking and disruptive technologies, China's innovation strength lies in its incremental upgrades and network effect across its vast industrial ecosystem, which is well positioned for steady technological advancement. This is the kind of innovation environment that is widespread across China, and the ITIF report does a fantastic job analyzing China's innovation model. To make sure I'm not just repeating the insights from ITIF's impressive report, my value add to today's conversation is that we walk through a thought experiment. If we were China's top leadership strategizing on technology security, what would Beijing's plan for leveraging innovation to fuel national strength be? How successful has China been in executing its tech security strategy? A key part of China's tech security strategy is outlined in the book, quote, "The Total National Security Paradigm, a Study Outline," end quote. This is a book that was released in April 2022 by the CCP Central Propaganda Department and the Central National Security Commission. This is General Secretary Xi Jinping's formulation of a comprehensive national security strategy framework. In a chapter about technology security, Xi Jinping emphasizes that, quote, "Science and technology are the foundation of national strength and prosperity, and innovation is the soul of national progress," end quote. To protect this soul, China aims to become a leading tech power capable of countering strategic rivals. Official documents, such as this one, acknowledge that China lags in some technology areas. However, this book also noted that China is rapidly advancing and even leading in several cutting-edge fields. To turn technological leadership into economic growth and geopolitical power, Beijing has implemented policies like dual circulation, Made in China 2025, and the Document 79 from 2022, which aims to eliminate reliance on Western ICT technology in state-owned enterprises by 2027. By 2035, China plans to achieve technological supremacy through many of these targeted strategies. From reading this chapter on safeguarding China's tech security from this book, it seems that China's plan to achieve tech supremacy has three main prongs. The first prong is China wants to preserve and strengthen its existing advantages. China can leverage its deep manufacturing expertise, large and skilled labor force, dense supplier networks, and a systematic approach to industrial upgrading. For example, China is a global leader in electronics and renewable energy equipment. By continually improving production processes and keeping prices competitive, China has dominated these industries and is likely to maintain its lead. Additionally, advancements in industrial robotics, which combine AI-driven software and hardware, signal China's move toward the next phase of industrial innovation. The second prong of China's tech strategy is China wants to address its technological gaps. China is determined to overcome its technological shortcomings, such as those in the semiconductor industry, where it has long depended on foreign expertise and components. Strict export controls by the US, Japan, and the Netherlands have exposed China's vulnerability in this critical sector. In response, the Chinese Party State has ramped up efforts to develop a self-reliant semiconductor industry, investing heavily in domestic production and reducing dependence on foreign technology. However, challenges remain, such as restrictions on semiconductor equipment exports and maintenance from companies like ASML, which hinder China's ability to develop advanced nodes. Despite these obstacles, China continues to push for innovation to overcome these barriers. The third prong of China's technology security strategy is that China wants to secure a pioneering edge in emerging technologies. China aims to lead in emerging tech areas, one example being artificial intelligence. Unlike the United States, which excels in breakthrough AI developments like large language models, China leverages its vast access to data from its population to drive AI advancements. Chinese tech giants like Baidu, Alibaba, ByteDance, Tencent, and numerous research institutes are leading this push. Companies like SenseTime are not only advancing domestically, but also expanding internationally by helping authoritarian regimes develop AI-enabled smart cities and surveillance systems. This determination positions China to make significant strides and potentially rival major global players in the AI sector. There are four significant challenges that face China today that I will skip over because just in the interest of time, but just to go through them. The four awkward elephants in the room, if you will. First, it's uneven quality of human capital inside of China. Second is the tendency for inofficial capital allocation. The third is the drag from bureaucratic inefficiency and corruption. The fourth is China's challenging geopolitical environment. At the heart of China's strategy is the Chinese Party State's vision and political resolve. In a 2020 speech, Xi Jinping highlighted that the world is undergoing unprecedented changes and that scientific and technological innovation is key to navigating these shifts. Xi's confidence, saying, quote, "Time and momentum are on our side," end quote, reflects the party's readiness to endure significant hardships to achieve its long-term goals. Analysts like scholar Evan Medeiros suggest that the Chinese Party State's willingness to tackle deep-rooted structural issues, despite economic struggles, shows the party's commitment to long-term strength. This resilience and political resolve could enable China to move from quantitative growth to qualitative transformation, advancing its technological and geopolitical ambitions without major compromises. In conclusion, China's strategic integration of tech security into its national security framework, along with its three-pronged approach to achieving tech primacy, shows its determination to secure a leading innovation position globally. Nevertheless, significant challenges, including uneven human capital development, inefficient capital allocation, bureaucratic inefficiency, and geopolitical tensions, pose substantial risks to the strategy's success. The Chinese Party State's vision and unwavering political resolve will be crucial in navigating these challenges. While China may be behind the United States on net innovative capacity currently, as assessed in the ITIF study and reports, its ideological environment is less contested than the one in the United States today. Specifically, the Chinese Party State's approach to industrial policy and technological upgrading is backed by an almost unified ideological fervor that the United States currently cannot match. The ITIF report calls for America to adopt certain elements of China's approach to technology policymaking and lays out many thoughtful policy proposals centered on a national security capitalism. Those proposals are more well thought out than anything I can conjure up. However, one thing I know for sure is that the outcome of China's technology security strategy, which is whether China can secure an innovation advantage and combine it with its existing scale advantage, will not only shape China's future, but also have profound implications for the global order, potentially redefining international power dynamics in the years to come. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate the report. I appreciate Rob having us here. I think the report points out some really important elements. I won't reproduce it. We don't have that much time anyway. I'd like to start with sort of a few myths and some megatrends. I think when we're sort of looking at China's innovation system, and I think the report does a very good job of pointing much of this out. It doesn't talk about this specifically, but this is something you hear in this building quite a lot, which is that China has stolen its way to being an innovator. While Chinese IPR theft is a massive problem, it is not a driver of China's innovation. China's IPR theft, to be frank, today is actually, from a strategic perspective, has greater impact as it relates to depriving U.S. firms of profits and market share that enables the U.S. innovation system to continue to drive innovation through churning profits back into research and development. Most of what China gets and most of what China has gotten in developing its innovation system has been done through legal means. The vast majority of China's sort of ability to move forward with really innovative companies was done through partnerships with foreign companies, through partnerships with foreign universities, with their students traveling abroad and bringing that technology back, either to be students or then working in major corporations. So the myth that where China finds itself today is something it stole its way into. And so therefore what we need is some sort of research security function is going to solve this problem is actually detrimental. There is a research security and research integrity aspect to this, but it's actually, the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the iceberg is 90% below. It's in the licit side, the cooperation that undertakes. And China can't be innovative. This is another myth you hear, that sure, they're good at copying and this would be illicit or licit, but are they really truly innovative? The CEO of Ford just came back from China, did an article about it just a couple of days ago. I spent time looking at the Chinese EVs, brought some back to his leading staff and said, this is the existential threat. Like, this isn't just a cheaper car. This is a more innovative car. It's providing, functionality and technology at scale in ways that consumers want that nobody in America is producing today. Right. And we see this in other industries. So that's a myth that folks need to get out of their mind. The PRC can innovate. They innovate all the time. They didn't steal their way there. They actually worked very hard to get there. But the mega trends that underlie this, I think, are where the interesting parts come, which is there's sort of two big mega trends going on right now. And both of them are part of this sort of Chimerica matrix, right? And Chimerica in the sort of science innovation, global sort of science innovation cluster is in full swing. It still exists. It has been very little restricted. It looks pretty close today that it did back in 2018. There have been some nibbling around the edges, but quite literally, our two science industrial complexes are almost completely intertwined. The United States' partner of choice for basic research is not Japan, it's not the United Kingdom, it's China. If you look at the number of papers that are jointly published with PRC nationals and PRC research institutions and U.S. researchers and research institutions, it's higher with the PRC than it is with any other single country. If you go and look at many of the top sort of basic science papers that underlie the technologies that these firms then turn into applied products and services, what you'll find is that the U.S. government is joint funding basic research with China's National Natural Science Foundation, with China's Academy of Sciences, with state key labs on things like quantum material science and others. And they're being joint funded by our Department of Energy, our Department of Defense, including the Army Warfighter Program, and the National Science Foundation. So the United States and China are completely intertwined, but it is China that benefits most from this. So the mega trend here is that China continues to rely immensely upon its unfettered access to U.S. innovation in order to drive its innovation system. We built the largest, most important university, Tsinghua University. You can go back and look at the most important AI research center in China. Microsoft Research Asia was built by Microsoft. Tong Xiao'o, a graduate of Tsinghua University, an employee of Microsoft, went back and created the single most important AI cluster in China. You can track most of the leading AI cluster back to these transfers. There's another mega trend that's going on, again, where China is looking at the United States as a model and sort of following it either by accident or by choice, which is today, the vast majority of research in development in the United States takes place by 5 companies, right? The top 5 R&D companies provide more R&D as a percentage of national R&D spending than the U.S. government. The U.S. government spent about $190 billion in R&D. The top 5 companies, I'm sure you guys all know who they are. Time is short, I won't mention them. Over $210 billion. The same is true in China. You have the government, and then you have the big 5, the big companies. The difference is those companies, aside from Huawei, have unfettered access to the U.S., to our capital markets, to our researchers. They hire top researchers. They bring them in and run labs. Alibaba's top quantum research facility outside of China is outside of Bellevue, Washington. They set up a separate quantum research center. They continue to hire graduates and postdocs coming out of those programs. Another aspect of this integration that continues, one of the technologies that really is the foundation of almost every one of those technologies up there is material science. And material science is an area where the United States is no longer actually a leader. It's one of the few areas where in basic science or in innovative breakthrough science, the United States no longer leads. But material science is a foundation for semiconductors, for autos, for nuclear, for AI. You go on down that list. The number of top university programs in material science out in China outnumber the number of top university programs in the United States. In 2017, the Japanese government did a study of leading edge technologies, and they used a series of different proxies, but the one they liked the best was the 1% most highly cited papers. What they discovered was that China was about 32% of all the 1% most highly cited papers in material science in the United States was about 28%. However, it didn't take into account that Chinese nationals and postdocs dominate U.S. material science programs. So the U.S. number is far lower than it appears. Another myth is that Chinese nationals come study here, and that's great for us no matter how many come because they stay. That's not true. Actually, DHS data shows that less than 35%, closer to about 29% of STEM graduate students ever transfer to a visa category that would allow them to become attain permanent status in the United States, which means that 70% of graduate STEM students who come to this country in the PRC return. Ministry of Education data from China says that since 2005, 92% of all Chinese students have returned. Their own data shows they're returning internally, but the myth is that, only like 10% go back. That's not true. It hasn't been true for a very long time. One last sort of little case study before time runs out. Our top material science program in the United States is at Georgia Tech. That Georgia Tech program it's trained probably about 40 or 50 PhD graduate students in the last couple of years. According to the website of the program itself, 8 times as many PRC nationals graduated with PhDs and went back to teach at Chinese universities, to become leaders of Chinese firms, and to run state key labs than the number of Americans who passed through the same program. So the best material science program in the entire nation is producing 8 times as many new professors and lab researchers in the PRC than they are producing in the United States. They produced essentially 2 that stayed on in the U.S., that were U.S. citizens that went on to teach. They produced over 65 PRC PhD graduates from the program who returned to run programs in the PRC. They absolutely must maintain the sort of chimerica integration into our science innovation system. Without the ability to refresh, because as was spoken about earlier by Emily, there is a repressive political system that makes innovation difficult. There is a capricious nature to it. The ability to recycle innovation antibodies from recent graduates and postdocs who run through our system is one of the key elements that enables the PRC to continue to be innovative and enables them to be a fast follower, a peer, or an actual industry leader across the board. And the longer we wait to get after some of these aspects of it, the less likely we are to win this challenge. And not to be hyperbolistic, but if we lose the technology challenge, we lose global leadership. It is that simple. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Emily and Rick, for that excellent commentary. We're going to take questions for about 10 minutes from our audience in person and audience online. So get your questions ready. Before we get there, let me just note that, as Rob stated at the outset, our panel is going to talk about, the innovativeness of Chinese firms. Rob's going to come up afterwards, and then with the next panel, talk about the differences between the U.S. and Chinese innovation and economic systems more broadly, and then also what the United States should do about it. So that'll be the topic for the second half of the panel. And several things y'all both said struck me. One thing you talked about scientific publications, Rick. As I said, I wrote the EVs report. 65% of the high impact scientific publications in the field of EV and propulsion are now going to Chinese authors. You talked about semiconductors, Emily. Now, while most of this is in the legacy space, China last year installed more new chip making capacity than the rest of the world combined. So really, across all these industries, the catch up is rapid. And I should note that if you see this, if you aggregate all 10 industries and 44 companies, we find a mean score of 6. So net, we find that China is about 2 years behind. So just a level set on those points. All right. Any questions here from our audience? Please get those ready. Raise your hand as I wait for those. Oh, go ahead, sir. If you would, we're going to bring a microphone. If you would just be so kind to give us your name and your affiliation, we'd appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Evan DiPetrillo. I'm an AI fellow in Senator Todd Young's office. So Jeff Ding, who's a professor at George Washington, focuses on AI in China, has a new book out, and he's basically arguing that it's not so much innovation in the most critical sectors that is important to national power, but the diffusion of advanced technology throughout the broader economy. What is your take on China's ability to diffuse advanced technologies through the rest of its economy?
I could take this one first. I'm a huge fan of the diffusion deficit concept that Professor Ding has put out. I think the understanding is the Chinese system, if we're looking at the military civil fusion ecosystem, but also the larger research community or base, it's interesting to see, even like through all the sectoral studies, that some of the industries are much more embedded with the academic community. Like one of the examples that I can think of is the robotics report, which, and also there's one really interesting graph, I don't remember on which page of the report, where it talks about how, in fact, China's percentage of researchers that are embedded inside a US, in companies, Chinese companies, are actually comparatively lower than the embedding that's happening in the United States. So I think that could perhaps be a data point of this diffusion deficit, or rather it's suboptimal diffusion, if you will. But I think it's, again, like if you look at the whole forest, you might see this net being 2 years behind. But if you look at specific sectors, I think you will see very different pictures.
I think if you look at software, you're going to get a different answer. I think it's critical to remember this. So when it's sort of software services, the United States has an advantage. There's a whole number of reasons why our capital systems are generated towards that. But if you look at making things, the diffusion of technology, again, the point about China installing more industrial robots than the rest of the world combined, the US being a tiny fraction of that. When you look at hardware, their diffusion of technology is much faster than ours. So when you look at making actual physical things, and there's a reason for that, US firms don't like to invest, and US Wall Street and others don't like to put money into sort of the risky patient capital model, right? That we're going to build factories and we're going to make sure that they stick around. Whereas the PRC model purposely drives through a whole number of different levers long-term investment in productive capacity. And that's a real weakness, because in the end, software is great, software is powerful, but software runs on chips, right? And the investment in legacy chips, while they may not be the high-end chips, the legacy chips make everything in this room work. If you don't control the legacy chips, you lose control of the entire fundamental foundation of technology that makes all the other aspects of the really whiz-bang sort of innovation that we find so enamoring, that this is where Americans have this false sense of security that we're doing so well, we're so far ahead. We're not. We really aren't. And if you went into a world where it's industrial based on industrial base, we're really, really lagging behind, and we're in a very, very bad position, actually.
And if you look at the legacy chips, Chinese are pricing them 30% under the global average. So because these industries are massively subsidized, they're able to compete and subsist in the industries without having to earn market-based return like other companies do. And this, of course, deprives innovative companies across the rest of the world of the revenues they need to reinvest in future generations of innovation. So that's why Chinese innovation mercantilism is broadly so deleterious to innovation industries globally. Oh, good. I'll just go here as I saw your hand come up first, sir.
Hi, my name is Jacob Martin. I'm with International Technology and Trade Associates. One of the most striking things about this chart here is that you note that China is making only modest progress on semiconductors, but they're making rapid progress on AI. With how dependent the AI industry is on semiconductor development, how is China accomplishing this?
I think for two reasons. Well, I mean, if you think, and we have a colleague, Houghton Amar, who's our expert on AI, but I think AI probably consists of three elements, right? The computer processing capacity, the effectiveness of the algorithm, like how smart that code is, and then your access to data. And it's on the latter 2 points that China really excels, right? And access to data, because there's very little privacy, government controls on data. They can get the data wherever they want. Software, obviously, you don't have to have as much infrastructure in place to educate smart people to write code. But where there's the bottleneck, right, is in that hardware, in the physical chip. And of course, when we have global leaders like NVIDIA making those chips, then I think that's where they're not able to catch up as rapidly because they're not as strong in semiconductors yet. And by semiconductors report, interestingly, when you look at sector by sector, where China I found to be strongest was in AI chips with companies like Baren and with design of like Huawei chips from Hisense, whereas they weren't as strong on like the manufacturing tooling side. So, but that'd be my answer. I saw your hand, Sam.
Thanks very much for this. Sam DuPont with Senator Chris Coons. You looked at 10 different sectors. I'm just sort of curious. I'm sure there are sort of many answers for each different sector, but curious if you saw any trends as to why China lags in certain sectors, has succeeded in other sectors. Is it specific characteristics of those sectors? Is it U.S. policy? Is it Chinese policy? What accounts for that variance?
If I may, I mean, in some of those areas, what you'll find is where state-owned enterprises dominate. That's where there's less sort of innovation, and they're kind of lagging. In the areas where AI is more dominated by that new Big Five I was talking about, right? The equivalent of the U.S. Big Five that drive their innovation as well. And so you have startups, and you have those firms funding startups, and you have a more vibrant ecosystem in that regard. And so you see in some of the other, aside from nuclear, and I would note that the AP1000 was a Westinghouse technology, and so that their leap ahead in nuclear is 100% based upon the transfer of technology that DOE fostered through Westinghouse. So that's a unique one where the state enterprises where they're doing well. But in most of the other ones, you're going to find it's sort of legacy state like chemicals and other things. You've got legacy state-owned enterprises. They're not as good and they're not as nimble. And when you have the Big Five, the BATs and the others, pushing ahead, that's where the most innovative. They're driving incredible amounts of profitability. They're innovative, they're pushing ahead, and they're drawing upon an ecosystem of returnees in ways that state-owned enterprises find difficult to do.
Sam, just one thing in analysis. If you look at like EV batteries, Chinese enterprises control the entire value chain, all the way down to the mines, as well as the refining, the production of the cathodes and the anodes. So they have come to dominate that entire global supply chain. But in semiconductors, if you think like the laser alone in an EV machine has 480,000 parts to that laser, you have to rely on a global network of suppliers to have best-in-breed technologies to input. And in sectors like that, I think China's had a more difficult time catching up. Thank you for your questions. I'm going to now turn it over to Rob, who is going to carry on with the presentation and lead us into our second panel. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. If I could ask our two speakers to come up. So we're going to segue now. Look, we could do a whole day just on the Chinese semiconductor industry. So we're covering a lot, but we're going to focus now a little bit on what does this actually mean? What is the Chinese policy system? And most importantly, how should the U.S. respond? I can't think of two better respondents this morning. my colleague Liza Tobin, who is the Senior Director for Economy at the Special Competitive Studies Project, SCSP. If you haven't been on their website, really need to look at it. Incredibly valuable work across the board there, but in particular, what Liza's been doing. She is the former China Director at the National Security Council in the Trump administration, and she led U.S. strategies and policies related to China. Rush Doshi is the Senior Fellow for Asia Studies and the Director of the China Strategy Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations. Most recently, he was the Deputy Director for China and Taiwan for President Biden's National Security Council. So we're pairing like a Noah's Ark kind of thing here, but we'll.
Actually, Rob, we sat next to each other in the EEOB for about 10 months
Nice.
before I
That's
fled
right.
the boat.
Nice.
So bipartisanship
Yes.
at the White House.
Yeah.
Exactly, particularly on this issue. Okay.
Rob's pointing at
I turned it off. Fantastic. There we go. All right. So I think, as you've heard before, what I think the most important thing to understand about China, the U.S. economic thinking is really oriented around one thing, and that's allocation efficiency. Don't spend money on stuff the market doesn't need. Don't spend too much. Don't spend too little. If you subsidize the price of wheat, you might get too much wheat and not enough corn. So the entire system is around that, which is why it doesn't say we should have, you don't want to have pick winners or losers or anything like that. The Chinese system is not oriented at that. They don't care about that. They don't care about losing money. We heard about that new book, Lynn's book. By the way, I interviewed him on our podcast. He makes an important point, but it's not quite the relevant point, which is diffusion of technology is critical to raise productivity. Chinese don't care about productivity either. They really don't. What they care about first and foremost is dominating advanced industries that are global and lead to power. They don't care about productivity. They don't care about wasting money. They're focused really only on, or principally on one main thing, and that's gaining power. And they use words, you can go through all the various sort of sources there. They use martial terms. They use battle. They use dominate. They use win. We don't use martial terms. We use Ricardian terms. If you remember your college economics, trade is a win-win that engaged by both willing parties. Otherwise, it wouldn't be win-win. That's not how China looks at this. So what is the China goal? The China goal, and you can read it in many, many documents, is just to gain the high-level heights of most, if not all, advanced industries. And you have to understand, the share of global advanced industries as a share of GDP has been unchanged in the last 25 years. It's around 12%. Hasn't changed. It won't change. What China wants is they want to keep taking more and more of that market share, and more of that market share means less of our market share. Okay. So if you think about what are the Chinese, what is their system versus what is our system, you have to understand this is, in fact, Xi Jinping once talked about, the quote was essentially, what is really at stake here is which system is better. So this is really a battle of systems. As I said, the Chinese system is based on advanced technology dominance. It seeks national power. Our system is based on allocation efficiency. Their system is based on dynamic and productive efficiency. In other words, new stuff, new industries, new products. We think about advancing technology as we're going to fund more basic science because that's the way we get innovation. They don't think about that. They're funding technology. They're funding applied engineering, applied research. We look at, and Rick mentioned this, we look at things like what's the rate of return? Oh, this is an industry with a high rate of return. It must be good. Again, Chinese don't care about that. They're not looking for rate of return. They're looking for market share. You hear this conversation all the time. The Chinese have an unbalanced economy. They don't get enough consumer spending. If they could just figure that out. They don't want that. Their rate in national investment is twice as high as the US rate of national investment. That is a feature, not a bug. Because for them, they're willing to impoverish the proletariat for many, many decades to come because they think it's going to lead to a better and greater China. Are we willing to impoverish our proletariat for anything? Can we get a gas tax increase of 5 cents a gallon? Yeah, that's not happening. No way. Again, we don't have any real direction in technology, although that's thankfully begun to change a little bit with the CHIPS and Science Act. And lastly, how do we shape policy? We shape policy by this contention of interests. And Capitol Hill is the way that these all things get worked out. That's not how China works. So if you compare their innovation systems, ours is essentially a very linear system, kind of modeled after that famous scientist Vannevar Bush. We put money into this end, we discover things, then we invent things, we innovate, we get then the companies either go offshore or go bankrupt or maybe keep going. If you listen to Lena Khan's comment a while back on why we need to break up big technology companies, her argument was if you destroy the big technology companies, you'll get a lot more little companies. That's that model. The Chinese model is not that. It's copy, and I agree with Rick, it's not all stealing, but a lot of copying. Then they innovate, then they produce, and then they get in this virtuous cycle. They produce, they learn from that, they improve, they keep going. And that is a very, very different system than ours. I won't go into too much detail, but basically, as we look through each of these sectors, we started to identify commonalities that each of them had that looked like you could make it out as a factors of 10 S factors, science and engineering. In the Chinese, science and engineering costs are significantly lower than ours, even relative to China. So they're able to field massive amounts of engineers. So in this case, quantity can make up for quality. Head start. If you look at EVs, why are the Chinese ahead on EVs? Because they had a head start, because they forced consumers or incented consumers to buy EVs. We're not doing that. And so most people are like, I'm not going to buy an EV, not yet. Chinese built an industry, so they have a head start. The same thing with drones. Market size, I won't go through that. Speed, subsidies, of course, firm size. What the Chinese antitrust authorities do is they try to find firms that they could smash together and make them bigger. They're like pro-trust over there. So if you look at, for example, their high-speed rail, CRRC, those were two big, giant companies that the Chinese government forced to merge. Space, and I don't mean outer space for that, I mean space to innovate. What's really strange when you think about that is America, we have this view of ourselves that we give our entrepreneurs and our innovators this amazing amount of space. And we actually don't compared to the Chinese. The Chinese, if you want to go and start deploying drones someplace, you go ahead and do it. If you want to start putting EVs on the street, you go ahead and do it. If you want to go into a hospital and walk out with 10 terabytes of data on the same morning and then analyze it, you just go do it. So essentially, our argument is we need to adapt, and I won't go into the detailed specifics, which are in the report, but I think the most important thing is we're really guided in the US by a number of different competing economic doctrines. And sort of one side is sort of global free market capitalism. Another side, maybe on the progressive side, is anti-corporate systems that reject large corporations. But really what we need, I argue, is we need to think about a system of national power capitalism. When the defense committees in the Senate are considering whether to fund a new tank or whether to fund a new airplane, they're not going, I wonder how much money that's going to save us. I wonder what the cost-benefit analysis of that is. No, they're saying if we're going to be powerful, we have to have this weapon system. And I think we're rapidly approaching that point now, or we're already there, where we have to begin to say, we have to have an aerospace industry. We cannot lose Boeing. We just cannot. We have to have a domestic semiconductor industry. We have to have strong biotech biopharmaceutical firms. And I don't necessarily mean, massive handouts, et cetera, but a recognition that, a recognition that the government has a stake in making sure that we are strong in advanced technologies. And we just can no longer leave it up to individual firms to make those decisions, because those are not always going to be aligned with state interests. And I think now that we're competing with the Chinese in such a vigorous way for global power, and as Rick noted, if we lose this race, we should all think about going to live in the UK, because that's essentially what we'll end up like. We'll just be an interesting former global power that, nice place to visit, good TV, not very good weather. So we'll have better weather. With that, I'll turn it over to Liza. Over to you. Feel free to use this over there.
Thanks so much, Rob. And I just want to congratulate Rob and Stephen and the rest of the team at ITIF for a really tremendous report. I think it's a huge service to folks on the Hill, to policymakers. Thanks. All right, there we go.
Yeah.
And to the general public to put out essentially this comparative assessment across a number of key tech sectors and give at least their take on who's ahead, who's behind, and what the pace of change is. These kind of comparative assessments are tremendously difficult. How much qualitative versus quantitative data do you use? Data availability in China is obviously challenging. So I just want to congratulate them on taking a stab at that and doing a really great job and really sounding the alarm. I really like how Rob has smashed a lot of myths. Rick went through a lot of these, and just to kind of summarize, it's clear from what they've written in their report and from everything else that we see that the CCP is not optimizing for profit or productivity or consumer welfare. They're optimizing for power. And so the sooner we absorb that and start making policy decisions accordingly, the better off we'll be. This issue of can China innovate? I dealt with this when I was a China analyst back at the CIA, and around 2015, 2016 or so, we were thinking about this question, and the common understanding was China can't innovate. They just build things, they steal, they copy. But there started to be this creeping sensation that maybe that wasn't right. And as you can see, it's taken, 7, 8, 9, almost 10 years to start to have a change in awareness that, yes, they actually can innovate. And this has massive implications for our prosperity and our national security. So speaking after China experts like Emily, and we're going to have and Rick, and we're going to have Rush soon, I decided I won't focus too much on China. Usually when I talk at things like this, it's all China, China, China. But I think instead I'll focus a little bit on this link between building things and inventing things. So over the last couple decades, of course, the United States has mostly let that link atrophy and disappear, outsourcing, kind of downplaying the importance of production and manufacturing, and this process of learning by doing, where people on the factory floor actually tweak the process and the design as they go along. And so it's this process innovation. And of course, at the same time, China has mastered that link and mastered the art of process innovation. And as Rob has laid out in the report, that doesn't just matter for production, it actually matters for innovation and invention and things on the cutting edge. And if the trends continue as he's laid out, we're going to see them catch up and surpass us in more and more fields. I think production is incredibly relevant in this systemic rivalry that we're in with China. But I want to talk a little bit more about the U.S. And I'm an optimist. As a former policymaker, you have to be a persistent optimist when you're thinking about China. Policy trends and technology trends are, I believe, converging in a new way that wasn't true 3 to 5 years ago. So on the policy side, there's this growing consensus around everything from decarbonization to national resilience after the pandemic, to competition with China, to the needs of the Defense Department. On the technological side, my organization has been digging into the latest tech trends in advanced manufacturing, AI, automation, robotics, U.S. advantage in software-enabled industry and software-enabled manufacturing. There are exciting things happening in this space that were not the case. So think about taking things like ChatGPT and bringing them to the factory floor and enabling much faster, more efficient, more intuitive design and manufacturing. However, to get there, in our process of studying these tech trends, we came across a lot of really exciting startups who are doing things like leveraging AI to create entirely new types of metal that can be used to line fusion reactors, that can be used to make hypersonic missile nose cones, exciting things like this. But in too many cases, they are facing some obstacles to scaling. And so as policymakers and lawmakers thinking about this, I think in order to capture this particularly unique moment that we're in 2024, we need some solutions. And these are everything from scale-up financing, making, most of the VC financing goes into software, but to make sure that there's some government public-private partnerships to enable these companies to get money to scale. It's supporting manufacturing process innovation. We have some programs like Manufacturing USA that are small but mighty. They need to be scaled up. Rob has taught me that our programs are tiny compared to the Germanys, the Japans, and the Koreas. And lastly, of course, what always comes up is workforce. So we need to be able to navigate the challenges of a nation of not only educating and training our own workforce, but bringing in high-skilled immigrants from abroad and pairing that with common sense research security practices. So there's a lot more. Happy to talk to you more about our work in this space.
Great. Thank you. Rush.
Well, first, let me just say thanks to everybody for coming. This is a fantastic event and an even more impressive report. I have a lot to say about the report, but let me just start by talking about China. I think that it's important to note, you've heard now from Rob and from Liza, that China is not focused on allocative efficiency, but on power. And I think it's important to understand why. The Chinese Communist Party was formed in the ferment of the Qing dynasty's collapse, in the century of humiliation. And the basic animating theory for them moving forward was they needed to achieve fuqiang, wealth and power. And that has been the phrase, not just for Chinese nationalists, other nationalists in Japan and Vietnam too, but especially in China, that's been driving their pursuit of economic and technology dominance for a long time. And you don't need to take my word for it. You can read the text. Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, they all talked about this stuff. What are the four industrial revolutions? It's an interesting concept where people talk about we're in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution. In 2017, Xi Jinping gave a speech about these four industrial revolutions, borrowing from a Davos concept. He said the very first one was essentially steam power. And the US, actually Great Britain, was able to kind of jump on that train and be able to ride that to global supremacy. The second industrial revolution was electrification. And the United States rode that all the way to global dominance, and it sustained that dominance with the third industrial revolution, which is mass manufacturing. And what Xi Jinping said is that we're in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution. This is also a concept from Davos, as I mentioned. But this fourth industrial revolution is not just a chance to get rich, it's a chance to get powerful. And the geopolitical lens in which they look at technology and capacity cannot be dismissed. In fact, they don't dismiss it. You've seen in this report several references to it. You heard it from Rob and Liza and others, and you're hearing it again from me. So that is how they look at this, and that is not how we look at this, and that's a critical distinction. Second point, the conversation on these issues, thanks to this report and other reports, is changing. I think for a long time, we heard about a number of myths that people continue to believe about China's capabilities. Those myths, in many cases, are wrong. What I think is most interesting is in just the last few weeks, we saw a series of reports come out that help us better understand just how competitive China is. One is this report. Another is Marco Rubio's report on the Chinese industrial challenge. Mario Draghi in the European Union just wrote about how the Chinese industrial ecosystem poses an existential threat to European prosperity. And of course, The Economist a few weeks ago, or months ago now, had this extensive deep dive into innovation and basic science research capability in China, and on net, how that was exceeding some of the capabilities in the United States. So all of that suggests the conversation is now changing, which leads to a third point. That is a prerequisite to changing policy. You have to have your assessment of the situation change before policy can change. We are now witnessing a change in assessment. But I want to dwell on this point for a moment, because I think a lot of people say, look, China's growth is slowing. Their demography, it's bad. They're peaking. but they're not really paying attention to, I think, what's happening under the hood. Yes, all those things are true. Yes, China has challenges, but it's also the case that in industry after industry, they're gaining global market share. And that's not just in fast follow. We're talking about introducing world-leading products as well, as the report here notes. So that's why I want to focus on assessment, because it's easy to see right now a debate. Well, maybe we don't have to worry too much. They'll just slow down naturally. Versus, wow, they're 10 feet tall, and maybe they're just 8 feet tall, but they're still quite tall, and that's a problem for the United States. I think the next area of assessment I want to just briefly mention is, let me just tell you what it looks like to get the assessment wrong. There's a great book by my former professor, Aaron Friedberg, called The Wary Titan. It's about the experience of relative decline in the United Kingdom from 1895 to 1905. The second chapter is one of my favorites because it talks a lot about how they were discussing in Great Britain at the time just why they were losing competitiveness to the United States and Germany. And they were concerned about how they were going to get the initiative again. And instead of really rallying around a set of solutions to recapitalize their industry and increase their competitiveness, they essentially disagree about the assessment of what's happening, and nothing really happens when it needs to happen. And Great Britain goes into World War I essentially already a deindustrializing power. And in World War II, entirely dependent on the United States to sustain itself. And of course, today, a financial power to be sure, but not a manufacturing power. There's no reason why it couldn't still be a manufacturing power other than it made a different set of choices. And I think, as Rob notes, we don't want to be in that situation. The end game for the United States, if we don't get our act together, is that we would end up a deindustrialized power specializing in commodities, tax evasion, real estate, and tourism rather than industry. And that is not in America, I think anybody here wants, but that is where the trend lines are going if you look at our export profile. We look more like Brazil increasingly than we do like the US of the 1990s or the 1980s. That's not a great situation, which leads me to policy. So we have assessments that are beginning to change. We have reports like this one that are helping policymakers understand the problem. What do we need to do? And I was a policymaker for 3 years at the National Security Council as director and then deputy senior director for China and Taiwan affairs. We thought a lot about this. We worked on stuff like the Chips and Science Act. We worked on other industrial policy initiatives. Let me just say a few things. It's not just Chinese theft that we have to worry about. It's also the fact that many of these companies are incredibly competitive. They are successful. Sure, they're subsidized in many cases, but they also are able to benefit from scale. They are real performers, and we can't take that for granted. I think second, I would just note that the United States as an ecosystem that many countries would envy and want to access, and access to that ecosystem is a privilege, not a right, and we should be able to curtail access when it is not in our interest to provide it, and we should also beneficially offer that access to allies and partners who share our interests and values. I think in addition, I would note that their state has a role in helping the U.S. remain a competitive industrial power. This is not just a question that can be left to the markets. It's not just a question that can be left to companies. That's why Congress has taken action increasingly in a bipartisan fashion here, but we need more. And I think what you're seeing in the report from Rob and what you heard in the comments from Liza is that the kind of solutions we need aren't just tinkering around the edges, a few incentive programs here, or maybe a few tax credits there. They're structural changes that fundamentally alter the way in which we are able to compete. And they're not that dissimilar from the kinds of things this country has done in the past, and with a fair amount of political will could do again today. This isn't a hard thing for us to do. We have a lot of advantages. We just don't have the political will. And that's why I'm glad we're here on Capitol Hill today, because I think this is the branch of government more than the executive branch that matters in creating that capacity. And I could say that having worked in the executive, doing the best I could, but I think ultimately the solutions will come in a bipartisan fashion from Congress. Let me just end by, again, a note of optimism. In industry after industry, you're seeing the Chinese sort of catch up, sometimes surpass the United States. But this is a dynamic situation, a dynamic playing field. This is a fourth industrial revolution. And there are opportunities for the United States to achieve leapfrog again over China. And you see that in batteries right now, with the question of whether or not solid state batteries might be superior battery technology, and maybe we have a lead there. So we shouldn't, necessarily be pessimistic. We should be alarmed. We should be acting with a sense of urgency and bipartisanship. We should also focus on the fact that there are opportunities ahead of us should we configure our political and economic system to take advantage of them. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Rush. Congressman Moolenaar is almost here, who's head of the China Select Committee, and he's going to make some remarks. So we're kind of talk for a moment, and then as soon as he comes, obviously, I'll introduce him. Rush, you mentioned this is part of our legacy, and in fact, this report came out under the ITIF Hamilton Institute for Industrial Competitiveness. There's a great letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1816, where everybody who thinks, Jeffersonian ag, we're going to be an ag economy and all that stuff. And, and Jefferson said, yeah, I used to think that until we almost lost the War of 1812. And I realized if we had lost that war, everything would have been different. And the only way we can prevent that from happening is we have to have manufacturing, we have to have power. And that really was the US approach until the 70s. Both parties, long legacy of national developmentalism. We were trying to beat the Soviets. Why did we invest more in the 1950s than in R&D, federal government, than every other country combined, business and government? Every other business in the world, every other government in the world, U.S. government spent more on R&D in the early 1960s. I do want to ask both of you a question, which is, again, we may have to stop, but Rush, you mentioned that things are changing, that it's like you can't really make progress in policy until you come up with a framework that is related to what you want to do. Why has it taken as long as it has? And for both of you, why has it taken as long as it has, and what are the major barriers to keeping it, not having it go even faster?
Well, it's a great question. I think the first one is that perceptions change slowly. And so that we have this sticky sense in our minds of what China's capable of. And it's difficult to update that perception absent a major shock. You noted 1812 was a shock for Jefferson. We haven't had that 1812 moment, but it could come. And it would come probably too late for us to change the trend line. So my point would be that reports like this chip away at that perception, and they help people better appreciate the nature of change in this situation where China is far more competitive than people recognize. The second reason why this is difficult is politics. I mean, there are a number of industries, a number of sectors that have a different view of how the U.S. economy should work and what it should focus on. Maybe they're more focused on allocative efficiency than they are on production and developmentalism and capacity. And so what ultimately is going to be needed is political leadership that helps push back on certain vested interests and says essentially there is a better path forward for our prosperity and our national power. We're going to have to embark on that path together, given the trend lines.
Liza?
Money. I think consumers have gotten.
My bad. Sorry. There you go.
Sorry, there we go. Money. I think there've been a lot of kind of this sense that we were all taught from liberal economics about gains through trade. The pie gets bigger if we just open everything in this global fashion to free trade. Prices go down for everyone. And I think we've enjoyed the deflationary effects of China entering the global economy, especially since 2001. Wall Street has enjoyed access to the capital markets in China. I think what Rob's report does is focus on the future economic effects of China catching up in innovation, and that those risks may not be measurable in annual GDP growth, in inflation, in consumer prices, but we need to think bigger than that. We need to come up with this new economic paradigm that values things like national security, national resilience, jobs, having a manufacturing base that can produce what we need when we need it, whether we're going to war or entering a pandemic or just day-to-day producing what we need.
Yeah, question. Yeah, please wait.
I feel like each of you sort of outlined some parameters of policy ideas. Rush, you did that sort of explicitly, but Liza, you were also talking about we need to focus on capital access and workforce. And I guess I'd be interested in hearing maybe from each of you one big policy idea that you have that you think could help address some of these challenges. Maybe later.
We'll do it later. No, you can stay, but we'll
Okay.
just stay. We may have a few minutes left. One answer is there's a bill in the Senate to create an industrial development bank somewhere.
Yeah. That was my
Pardon?
Don't say that in the microphone.
So we're really pleased and honored that Congressman Moolenaar is here with us. He is the chairman of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with China. So could not imagine a better and more appropriate person to cap off the conversation that we've just been having this morning. He represents Michigan's 2nd District, and he brings years of leadership experience in both the public and private sector to Congress. So, Congressman, thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much. And Robert, thank you and your team for the effort that went into this report and for the invitation to speak today. For the past few years, 2 years, I've served on the Select Committee and since April have been the chairman. And for decades, I, along with many Americans, believe that an unbridled economic engagement with the Chinese Communist Party would lead to democracy in China and prosperity at home. And that, as we know, has not come to pass. And from the militarization of the South China Sea to unabashed economic coercion and market manipulation, flooding our communities with fentanyl, the Chinese Communist Party has shown its true colors. And the CCP has taken technological tools that we've given them to forge new surveillance chains to hold the Chinese people in bondage. And they've tried to extend these chains around the world, including to America itself. Lenin once observed, capitalists will sell us the very rope that we will use to hang them. The CCP has taken Lenin's view to heart. Like good Marxists, they see economics as an extension of politics, one in which they win by eliminating the competition. Joint ventures and investment are tools for Chinese firms to eliminate, not cooperate with American firms. I want to illustrate the stakes before us by telling the story of 2 companies. Both produce electric batteries. Both built factories in my home state of Michigan. The first was named A123, and it no longer exists. It had a unique technology, one with the potential to revolutionize the global electric battery industry. And it did, but not in the hands of A123. That battery technology, once owned by A123 and developed by Americans at the University of Texas and MIT, now belongs to a Chinese firm named CATL. With it, CATL controls about 37% of the global market for electric batteries. You see, in 2009, A123 Systems made a mistake. It was a mistake hundreds of companies have made in the past 5 decades. The company set up a joint venture with Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, a state-owned auto producer in China. The company had access to cheap labor, knew the Chinese domestic market, and was directly supported by CCP officials who could handle any regulatory hurdles that A123 might face. The problem was SAIC was really after A123's technology. Once it had access to that, the Chinese company then flooded the market with state-subsidized battery that used A123's own technology. Unable to compete, A123 found itself facing bankruptcy and was acquired by SAIC's holding company, despite CFIUS concerns. SAIC closed A123's U.S. operations, laid off the workforce, and relocated operations in China, where Chinese firm CATL now seeks to dominate the world's supply chains with this very same technology. Now CATL is returning to the scene of the crime, building a new factory in Michigan, subsidized by American tax dollars, and using American technology to deepen our dependence on supply chains controlled by Beijing. These tactics are unethical, they're wrong, they're dangerous. Worst of all, though, as today's report notes, these tactics are successful. Let me read out a few numbers from today's report. In 2023, China installed more industrial robots and had more nuclear power plants under construction than the rest of the world combined. China also accounted for 62% of global EV production. A majority of the world's new chip-making capacity in 2024 will be constructed in China. And from 2017 to 2021, the rate of new clinical drug trials in China grew faster than any other nation. These statistics should raise alarm bells in capitals around the world. The CCP's track record shows that any dependencies or open doors can be and will be weaponized by the party at a time and place of its choosing. This isn't speculation. This is a playbook we have seen far too many times to count. That playbook reflects the difference in values between ourselves and the CCP. For Americans, economic growth and innovation are pathways to improve the well-being of all parties. For the CCP, economic growth and innovation are about increasing the power of the party, both at home and abroad. Chinese entrepreneurs are supported, their companies subsidized, and their foreign competitors are targeted for IP theft and economic warfare. Entrepreneurs such as Jack Ma and foreign firms may have roles as temporary tools, but at the end of the day, they have no place in the house Xi Jinping is building. The CCP only wins if they and we lose. Our competition, like that with the Soviet Union, is not between two countries, but between two visions of the future. The only way of life, the only way our way of life survives is if we win and they lose. Our committee has been shouting this warning from the very rooftops. The Select Committee has traveled to Boston, New York, Silicon Valley with a simple message. We cannot continue to fund our own destruction. We cannot provide our greatest adversary with the tools needed to kill our men and women in uniform. We cannot continue supplying the technology that will be used to drive our companies out of business and leave our citizens out on the street. In 2023 alone, Wall Street channeled $5.7 billion of American investment to 61 PRC companies that the US government has blacklisted because they advance the PRC's military capabilities or support its human rights abuses. The companies receiving these funds develop advanced fighter jets and nuclear weapons for the People's Liberation Army and create the technology used to perpetrate the ongoing genocide against the Uyghur people. I'm proud of the work our committee's done in highlighting these troubling investments, as well as those in cutting-edge technologies such as artificial intelligence. We've made a real difference in the way the financial community talks about China and perceives the risk investing there. The Biosecure Act, which passed the House last week, directly challenges the dependence of much of America's biopharmaceutical community on companies like WuXi AppTec, WuXi Biologics, and BGI. It will ensure that over the next 8 years, we liberate our medical supply chains from CCP control without disrupting the existing markets. These pieces of legislation are, I hope, just the start. Last December, our committee produced a list of 150 bipartisan recommendations to rebalance our country's economic relationship with the PRC. If you know anything about Washington, you will know how rare that sort of bipartisanship is. Outbound capital and export controls are critical to our defensive strategy and buying the time needed to rebuild our industrial base at home. De minimis reform will allow U.S. manufacturers to compete on an even playing field. By holding PRC firms accountable for the use of slave labor, we take a stand in defense of our values and eliminate an unfair and immoral advantage. By protecting our companies and universities from IP theft, we defend American ingenuity and inherent advantages of a free system that encourages creativity and innovation over a totalitarian ideology that rewards blind obedience. But like my Detroit Lions, we must play both offense and defense. Research security and IP defense matter little if we are not researching new technologies or developing IPs to defend. For centuries, America has been the promised land for the best and brightest across the world who wanted to explore the frontiers of human knowledge or create companies without red tape. We must continue to be that promised land. And that means ensuring entrepreneurs are free to innovate, universities are free from foreign influence, and students are free to speak their minds. Export and outbound capital restrictions are a necessary condition for our victory over the CCP. And by combining these types of tools with investments in our own innovation, we can achieve victory. I want to thank you again for having me, and it's wonderful to be with you today. Hope you have a great day.
Congressman, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and those very wise words, and thank you for your leadership on the committee. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I do want to kind of end with maybe we're here, and so the $64,000 question is, okay, what do we do? So I have an idea, but I think, as the Congressman said, there are like 128 or so. There's really no end of ideas. There really isn't. I mean, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of things that we have to do. But I'm going to put you both on the spot and say, pick one or pick two, be on the top of your wish list if you were czar. Liza.
Sure. So there are emerging or well-developed policy efforts on a couple of the key technologies. IRA, EV batteries is one, chips, semiconductors is obviously another. But we need one that runs across all of these. So the enabling technologies that we need to get back in the game in production and manufacturing are this suite of advanced manufacturing technologies that are offering this opportunity as AI revolutionizes how companies make things. So SCSP has proposed a overarching national approach to advanced manufacturing with a number of lines of effort. And so I won't go into all of them there, but we have proposed this suite of proposals, everything from scale-up financing, and Rob mentioned one of the efforts that's in draft legislation for an industrial finance corporation, so something to help companies scale up. We need better cyber protection tools. Manufacturing experiences more cyber threats than any other sector. We need workforce efforts. We need trade policies that help insulate us from China's brute force economics. In any case, we've laid this out in the report, and we really need this so that we have the production base necessary to build and succeed in all the technologies that are in this report.
Great, thank you. Rush.
That's a great list. And I think I'll just make 2 points. And it goes back to what I said earlier, which is that I think what's necessary is thinking in structural terms about our policy prescriptions, not just piecemeal, but structural. The first structural proposal is one that's in this report, one, Rob, that you mentioned. It's sort of an industrial development bank, something that is critically needed, I think, in the United States, although perhaps a little controversial. But the reason it is needed is because if you look at the financial sector today, they can get great returns in software, but they're not so sure about hardware manufacturing. They're not going to be able to fill that gap. They're not patient enough. And you look at the trends in venture capital, it's all in that software direction until very recently, where there's now more zeitgeist around hardware, but we'll see if it translates into returns. So you need an industrial development bank to create structural conditions for firms to invest in the kinds of capabilities that we know we need and that financial markets don't always reward. The second structural proposal that I would put forward is a combination of something Congress can do and allies and partners need to do. The congressional element is to take my very favorite executive order, which is the ICTS executive order that the Trump administration put in place, but that the Biden administration used, most recently on the question of EVs and their connection to networks. I'd like to see that have some statutory basis so it's protected from litigation. And then I'd like to see it used as a way of creating barriers to dumping and excess capacity in the U.S. market. A lot of things have access, connect to networks, and it's pretty straightforward to be able to use that authority to prevent dumping, but also to ensure national security simultaneously. And the reason this connects to allies and partners is it's going to be really hard to get totally aligned with allies and partners on a trade agenda, no matter what happens in the presidential election or in Congress. But it's much easier to get aligned on a regulatory agenda. And regulatory harmonization that puts up these kinds of barriers might make sense for all of us, because the alternative is that we lose our industries. So those are two structural proposals that I think would find bipartisan support, I would hope, and would actually make a significant difference in the competition. Thanks.
Well, take the moderator's privilege by agreeing with that. And one of the things that we tend to overlook in this is competition in advanced industries is really, a lot of it is around market share, is the size, because these industries have what economists call high fixed costs, low marginal costs. Building the first piece of software, building the first plane, building the first chip cost an enormous amount of money. The last one you sell, relatively cheap compared to that. So that's why market access for us and limiting theirs. So 100% agree that we need to be working closely with our allies and limiting their market access to us. Stephen just wrote a report on Monday on displays. Chinese now dominate the LTE market, and they're close to getting dominance in the OLED market. And that has been through IP theft, but more importantly, massive subsidies. The CHIPS Act will fund chips, fabs here, and probably, including with the tax credit, maybe 30 to 35% total CapEx subsidy. In China, the CapEx subsidy for these OLED factories is 90%. How are you supposed to compete with that? Well, the way you compete with it is you basically say, hey, Hisense, I went to Best Buy the other day because our refrigerator kicked the bucket. And so I looked at the Chinese TVs, which, by the way, you don't know they're Chinese because not a big red symbol on it. A lot of Chinese TVs at Best Buy. So that's number one. Number two, sort of very simple. Our tax reform, or tax is coming up again next year because of the expiration. Two things one, we should just continue to put back in place first-year expensing. Companies tend to want to be capital light. This is an easy way to get more investment if they can write it off in the first year. And then related to that is the R&D credit. We did an analysis of R&D tax generosity around the world and ranked about 34 countries. The Chinese R&D credit is about 3.7 times more generous than ours. We rank 32nd out of 34 nations in R&D tax credit generosity. Back in 1994, we were number one. So we should double the R&D credit, not super expensive. And then my last one, which is a little bit of a little bit of an Overton window one. I was just in Taipei for a week, and I've long been a fan of what they have there called ITRI, the Industrial Technology Research Institute. ITRI is where TSMC came out of. Morris Chang worked there. I'm not saying Morris Chang's not an incredible entrepreneur, but the core technology really came out of ITRI. It's a national lab, but our national labs are focused on photons and photon torpedoes, I think, right? Their national labs are focused on industrial competitiveness. And I think we should create one. I think that would be a fantastic thing to do. By the way, interesting historical thing. Anybody want to guess where ITRI was originally, how it was originally created and who funded it? AID. We created it because we wanted Taiwan to be strong. So we created it. So it's good enough for them, should be good enough for us. I think we're at time here. So I want to thank all of our speakers from this panel and the other one. Great comments. And thank everybody for going through the labyrinth of the maze of getting into this room. I know it was a little difficult for some of you. So with that, thank you so much, and please join me in thanking our great speakers.